Thank you guys very much for being here today. I just flew in last night. It's always good to be in Iowa. I appreciate you guys spending this beautiful day here indoors, listening about all these great issues that are affecting the lives of people with disabilities. So again, my name is Chris Rodriguez. I'm the Director of Public Policy for National Disability Institute. We're a DC-based disability-related advocacy organization. We have about just under 40 employees, 30 of which are in Washington, and then about 10 to 15 of them are spread across the country. What differentiates us from other disability-related organizations is that we have a very focused mission to help people with disabilities improve their financial circumstances and to increase their economic mobility. So that's all individuals with disability across the spectrum of disability. So today I'm here to talk about the ABLE Act. How many people in the room have at least heard of the ABLE Act? All right, okay, that's gonna make my job much easier. So what we're gonna do today, at least in my part, is go over some of the basics related to ABLE, and the things that I'm gonna be talking about are things that are gonna be consistent across all ABLE programs, no matter if you are enrolled in the Iowa plan or the Ohio plan or the California plan or whichever plan. The majority, if not all, of what I'm going to discuss is going to be consistent across all programs because it's basically talking about the federal law. And then we're going to have some more specific information here in a little bit about the Iowa plan. So let's go ahead and get started. So the ABLE Act's formal name is the Stephen Beck Jr. Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, and it was signed into law on December 19th of 2014 after nearly a decade of federal, state, and local advocacy. By the time it made its way to the president's desk, it had overwhelming bipartisan support both in the Senate and in the House, but certainly that didn't happen overnight. Like I said, it took about 8 years to get this particular piece of legislation through Congress. So no small feat. In its most basic sense, it creates a new option for some people with disabilities and their families to save for their future while protecting their public benefits. And we're going to go over about what I mean by public benefits here in a little bit, and we're going to talk about why I say some people with disabilities and their families as opposed to all people with disabilities and their families. So, what is an ABLE account? So these accounts are established in a new section called 529A, or Cap A, short for capital A, Qualified ABLE Programs. So if you ever hear somebody talking about 529A accounts, that means the same thing as ABLE account. Don't let that trip you up. That just happens to be the more technical name for it based on where it's found in the tax code. ABLE accounts are qualified savings accounts that receive preferred federal tax treatment. And we're going to talk about what exactly that means. What is preferred federal tax treatment? What does that mean? We'll talk about that in a little bit. And they enable eligible individuals to save for disability-related expenses. And again, we have these very loaded terms that we're going to unpackage later on in the presentation, such as eligible individual. What does that mean? And disability-related expenses, what does that include, right? We'll talk about that here in a little bit. There are currently 20 ABLE programs enrolling qualified individuals, most of which are enrolling folks nationwide, meaning that provided that you meet the eligibility criteria that we'll discuss in a little bit, you can enroll in their programs despite perhaps not living in that particular state. And we're very excited that we have 20 states having launched programs. I think it'll be 21 next week. I think Massachusetts launches next week, I want to say. And while you may be looking at it and saying, well, the federal law passed in 2014, why are we just now getting these accounts? These things take time. This is an absolutely new option for people with disabilities that they never had previously that allows them to save for disability-related expenses. And the big value of that is the funds in the account are not taken into consideration when determining eligibility for federally funded benefits such as Medicaid and Social Security and things like that. And what the law does is the federal law, it allows states to build these programs. It actually doesn't obligate them to do so. So a state has to elect to build these using state funds, which they have to find, and that all has to be done through state ABLE legislation. So it's been 8 years passing it in Congress, and then we went down to the states and started passing the ABLE laws. And we successfully passed, I think, just over 45 ABLE-related pieces of state legislation within the first year and a half. So that's incredibly quick when you take into consideration all that needs to happen in order for a bill to become a law. So it's actually very, very exciting. We expect by the end of the year, we'll actually have closer to 30 states having launched programs. Additionally, assets in and distributions for qualified disability expenses will be disregarded or given special treatment in determining eligibility for most federally funded means-tested benefits. And we're going to talk about why I say most as opposed to all, because there is one exception. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Okay, what are some important requirements of ABLE accounts? And again, these are going to be things completely consistent across every single program in the country. No matter where you decide to enroll or what program you're opening your account with, these things will remain consistent across all programs. They're founded in federal law. So each eligible individual may only have a single ABLE account. So if I'm an eligible individual and I open up an account here in Iowa, I can't then go to Ohio or Nebraska and open up another one. I can only be the beneficiary of one ABLE account at any given time. Another important aspect is the designated beneficiary is the account owner. So there's 3 terms that you might hear. It always refers to the same person. It could be designated beneficiary, person with a disability, account owner. Under all circumstances, that is the same person. It's the person with a disability, right? The person with the disability is the beneficiary, and they are also the account owner. This is very important to recognize, and this was very important when passing the law and when creating and developing the law, because we wanted to make sure that this tool allows people with disabilities the greatest autonomy with respect to handling their finances. We've done a really, I think, good job over the last 10, 15 years to start pushing employment for people with disabilities, allowing folks with disabilities to show their talents in the workplace. We've started to allow them through things like this to save funds. It's important that they can exercise use over those funds to the best extent possible. Now, that being said, what happens, a common question is, what exactly happens if the individual, the beneficiary, the account owner, the person with a disability, either doesn't have the capacity to oversee the account, or for whatever reason they just don't want to. They don't want to choose. They want an ABLE account, but they don't want to actually exercise signature authority over it or authorized signature authority over it. The law says that there's 3 types of individuals who can have signature authority, setting up an account and basically overseeing it on behalf of the beneficiary. And those can be a parent, a guardian, or a person with power of attorney. So if you are not one of those 3 people, those 3 types of individuals with respect to the beneficiary, the person with a disability, the account owner, then you cannot have signature authority over the account. So as an example, I have a brother in Texas who's eligible to open up an ABLE account, who has an ABLE account actually. I'm his brother. We have a very close relationship. I understand his needs extremely well. I've been a professional in the disability community for a long time now. I'm not his guardian, and I don't have power of attorney. I'm his brother, despite knowing him extremely well. Can I open up his ABLE account, or can I have signature authority over his account? No, I cannot, because I'm not one of those 3 types of people, right? My mom is his guardian. She has signature authority over his account because he chooses not to exercise authority over it. So that's important to understand. Another misnomer is that, and we addressed this a little earlier, that you have to live in the state in which you enroll. Now, the reason why this misnomer exists is because when the law originally passed, there was a residency requirement stating that if you live in Iowa, then you can only enroll in the Iowa plan. Now, Congress took a look at that once they passed the original law and said, well, you know what, we're not obligating states to actually build these programs, so despite all this work and all the benefits that we've recognized on the federal level, if, say, Iowa didn't want to pursue building a program for whatever reason, then despite having that federal law passed, people in Iowa who would qualify couldn't open up an account. Congress didn't like that. So they went back in about a year later and got rid of that. Despite getting rid of it, Iowa still went forward, which is great and amazing, and we're very happy that they did. And again, we're going to hear more about the program here in a little bit. Yeah, go ahead. Right, so that's why we strongly encourage there to be some kind of succession. So in my parents' case, if my parents or when my parents pass away, I am then the guardian over my brother's estate. So then I would have, right, excuse me?
So I started up, because I already set an account now for my minor child, and then I pass away in 40 years or whatever, and my other child will become his guardian or
Whoever you designate. Mm-hmm. So whoever his new guardian would be able to exercise authority. That whoever the guardian is at any given time, is my understanding.
Is that you have to wait until another person, they may be designated, but they have to apply to be the guardian for that person. In that interim time, how are their protections on that?
So that's a good question. Do you know that?
So the question is, and I apologize, this doesn't amplify my voice. It's for the camera. So if the question is what happens if the guardian passes away, what we would do is we would put a freeze on the account once we became aware of that until there was a new guardian. So those funds would be safeguarded. We would hope that would move quickly, so that those funds would be available. But if we didn't have somebody available at the time, that's what Iowa would do.
They could give somebody power of attorney to help them out with it.
Iowa, yeah, you can designate somebody as a power of attorney over your ABLE account.
So the account owner is always no matter if you have somebody else that has signature authority over it, the person with the disability is always the account owner. Somebody else just has signature authority over the account. And we are hoping that we're going to get more specificity in terms of all these questions when Treasury and IRS comes out with their final rules and regulations. And these are issues that we've brought up with them and other different agencies. And you'll notice that as we go forward in the presentation. Back to some of the consistencies across all programs. So again, there's no federal law. The part of the federal law was taken away that talked about residency requirements. So provided that you meet eligibility criteria and provided that the program is actually enrolling nationwide, of which are the vast majority of the programs, you can enroll in a program in which you do not live in that particular state. And moreover, let's say, so my brother lives in Texas with my parents, and Texas has not launched their program yet, but they hope to sometime in the next few months. He could, if he thinks it's in his best interest, roll over his current account, which is in a different state, to the Texas program. So you can roll over, it's called a program-to-program transfer. But again, you can't have two. So it's kind of instantaneous, so technically you don't have two during that period of time. So also, it has a total annual contribution from all contributors combined, of which can be anybody can contribute into an ABLE account, but all those contributions combined in any given tax year are not to exceed $14,000. So that's every single contributor, all combined from January 1 to December 31st, cannot exceed $14,000 into the account. Again, anybody can contribute into the account, friends, family, including the beneficiary themselves as a result perhaps of employment. They can contribute their funds into their ABLE account, provided that it's within the parameters of that $14,000 cap. Additionally, there's another cap, an aggregate contribution cap, and that is the limit on that account is equal to the 529 college savings limit in the state in which you've enrolled. And that's typically anywhere from about 250,000, I think is the most modest, all the way up to maybe 550, 600,000. Iowa's limit is 320,000. 420,000. So as you can imagine, I mean, you might want to take that in consideration. However, at $14,000 a year, you know, it's going to take some time to get there. Okay. So we've gone over some of the very basic information about ABLE accounts, ABLE programs, things that are going to be consistent across all programs. Now, one of the big questions is who exactly are eligible to open up these accounts? Why did I describe them as a tax advantage savings account for some people with disabilities as opposed to all people with disabilities? And that's because not all people with disabilities are qualified to open these. There is eligibility criteria, and it's basically in two different parts. So one has to do with the age in which the individual first experienced their disability or had an onset of disability. And that has to be prior to the individual's 26th birthday, right? So it says onset of disability is what the law says. So onset of disability. So that doesn't mean, and again, in my brother's case, he's 34. He has intellectual developmental disabilities that was clearly recognized at birth. So despite him being 34 years old, which is older than 26, can he still open up an ABLE account? According to the age, does he meet the age provision? Yes, because he had an onset of disability prior to his 26th birthday, despite the fact that he's opening his account at age 32, 33.
If it's not recognized, if the signs are there, but they're not certified as disabled by the Social Security, does that meet the criteria?
So how is Iowa handling that?
Well, I think in Iowa, so determining that, we're probably going to look to it's self-certification is the key. So you have to have the documentation that is going to, I would say if you're getting a federal tax benefit, I would make sure you have something from a physician. I can't give legal or tax advice. That if a doctor could say the onset of this was prior to age 20, I mean, that's what's key is, and not necessarily when the doctor wrote the letter, when the doctor can say the onset.
Right. And it certainly doesn't have to do with it, a determination specifically from Social Security Administration about the disability. So what you would want to really do to be safe is have, again, some type of medical documentation documenting and certifying that the disability had an onset, in all likelihood had an onset prior to the person's 26th birthday. And the entity that's responsible for making sure that these accounts are being used within the confines of the law is the IRS. So they could do a random audit on an individual, of which I presume they would look at two things. One, is the individual actually eligible to have this type of account? And two, are the expenses that have been provided, that have been paid for with ABLE funds actually qualified disability-related expenses? And we'll go over that in a little bit. So let's go there real quick. Yeah. So let's say that you do meet the age criteria. Now you have to meet a second type of criteria, and that relates to the severity of the disability. So if you are currently receiving SSI or SSDI, basically Social Security Administration has determined that you meet their standard of severity and disability, then you're good to go. So if you're a beneficiary, my brother's a beneficiary of SSI, and he clearly had an onset of disability prior to his 26th birthday, boom, he's good to go. He can go and open up his account, of which is all done online. This is not something that you go into a brick and mortar bank, your Bank of America, and say, hey, I want an ABLE account. This is done online through the particular program that you feel comfortable enrolling in. And it's you enroll online and you maintain the account online. So that's important to know. So what happens if the individual for some reason either doesn't never felt the need to apply for SSI or SSDI but still has a severe disability, or for whatever reason has been denied but they still feel as though they meet the certain severity criteria under SSA's definitions? Can they still open up an ABLE account? And presumably they've met the age criteria. The answer is yes, but they would need a disability certification assuring that the individual holds documentation of a physician's diagnosis and signature and confirming that the individual meets the functional disability criteria in the ABLE Act. So that's important to note as well. So basically what was behind this in terms of Congress is they said, well, what if a person, let's say, who has Down syndrome, has a job, clearly has a disability that occurred prior to age 26, but yet they're making too much money at their job, so despite meeting certain criteria related to SSA's definition of disability, they are not receiving SSI or SSDI. We want to make sure that we're not prohibiting people with disabilities who happen to work from having ABLE accounts, right? Or maybe you have too many assets to have an ABLE account. Too many assets to be qualified for SSI. We still want to make sure those folks can appreciate the benefits under that. And that's basically what this does. And the definition in this particular law in the ABLE Act is basically, if you're familiar with SSA's SSI child definition, which is basically talks about severity and takes away the entire part about work or ability to work. And that language is within the law. Okay. So So we know some of the basics behind what's consistent across all programs. We now know, we have an idea of who could be eligible and the criteria related to eligibility. Now the next big question often is, what exactly can these funds that are contributed and held within an ABLE account be used for, right? What are qualified disability related expenses? So a qualified disability expense are all expenses that relate to the designated beneficiary's blindness or disability, are for their benefit and help them increase or maintain their health, independence, or quality of life. So that's wildly broad, right? Wildly, wildly broad. And we wanted to make sure that it was defined like this because we appreciate that the needs of people with disabilities, specifically those with the severity that would meet the criteria in which one would need to fall under to open an account, are very broad, the needs of a person with a disability like this, right? Based on their circumstance, their disability, their resources, things like that. And we wanted to make sure that their needs could be met to a great extent through the funds that are contributed into these accounts. So we have an extremely broad definition. And whether or not something is a qualified disability expense, at least to me, really something that has to be seen through the eyes of the person with a disability. And again, this is something that would presumably be checked through an audit type situation by the IRS. Our advice at NDI and in the ABLE National Resource Center to ABLE account beneficiaries and persons with signature authority is obviously document the expenditures that are being purchased with ABLE funds, and then, at least I tell my mom, jot down, doesn't have to be exhaustive, but a few sentences on, my brother's name is TJ, how did this particular purchase help TJ increase or maintain his health, independence, or quality of life? So an example I give, my brother does therapeutic equestrian horseback riding in the spring. It's not covered by Medicaid, it's very expensive. So I can contribute funds into his ABLE account to help him pay for those lessons, of which we've discovered, because his mobility and issues, he has a hard time exercising, and that's provided for wear and tear, and he has a hard time walking. But just riding the horse helps him work his core just by naturally being on the horse and riding in this type of therapy. Now, if the IRS took a look at this and just said, and didn't know my brother, and obviously, and you can't expect them to know anything about disabilities because that's not under the purview of their job, and said, why in the world are we using these ABLE funds are supposed to be used for disability-related expenses for this guy to ride around on a horse all day, right? So obviously it's important that my mom jot down, TJ has issues with mobility. It's proven after several lessons over the years that this helps him with his mobility issues, which increases his independence. Piece of cake, that's that. If she ever gets audited, she would provide that to the IRS. And presumably that would be justification to assure that that particular purchase of his horseback riding is within the confines of what would be considered a qualified disability-related expense. Let's see here. The NPRM went so far as to say that they also include basic living expenses. They can include basic living expenses. They wanted to point out there's no medical necessity. These aren't Medicaid dollars. You don't need to go to a doctor. A doctor doesn't have to sign off saying, yes, TJ needs a wheelchair and now we can go buy that with ABLE funds. That's not the way this works. Much, much more broad. Why? Because these are private dollars. Dollars contributed into the account are post-tax dollars from people. It's not government funds and things like that, which obviously have a large amount of restrictions under them because they're public dollars, right? Congress also provided what I call different types of buckets or different categories in which these funds could fall under. And as you can see here, it's quite a laundry list of different things, everything from education to housing, transportation, financial management help, health prevention and wellness, all the way to basic living expenses, funeral and burial expenses, and then they have kind of a catch-all. Any other expenses approved by the Secretary of the Treasury under regulations consistent with the purpose of the program. So again, extremely, extremely broad. And again, this is because we understand that the needs of individuals with disabilities varies from person to person. And we can't put a rigid list together saying this is all you can use these funds for, because we don't know that that would best meet the needs of all people with disabilities that could be qualified to open up these accounts. So those are all the ways you should use it. What happens if you don't? What happens if you find a way to misuse the funds? So distributions for non-qualified expenditures will be subject to tax consequences and may affect the individual's eligibility for federally funded means-tested benefits, including things like Medicaid and SSI. So that's incredibly important, considering how important those particular benefits are to people with disabilities. So it's vastly important that people understand how to use these funds appropriately so they don't put themselves or the person with a disability in a vulnerable position with respect to losing their benefits. The other part of that definition has to be for their benefit. So if my brother has a ton of money in his ABLE account and he decides to purchase or rent a place, a 3-bedroom apartment, and he's got 2 buddies living there, is it justifiable that's specifically for his benefit? Probably not. That probably wouldn't be okay, because the funds have to be for that person's benefit. There are incidental benefits that can be provided, but it's got to be within reason. If you could purchase a car to get from point A to point B, and if somebody else happens to be in the car, is that okay? Probably. If you're renting a 3-bedroom apartment and 2 people are staying there for free, probably not a good idea, right? He'd have to pay for the portion of his part, and it'd have to be within reason. So housing expenses are provided that they're paying for their portion of it, I would say. It gets a little tricky when you're talking about if that person's under SSI, because you have what's called in-kind support and maintenance, right? That could deduct, yeah. So SSI, the SSI cash benefit is there to provide for basic living expenses like things like room and board, stuff like that. So if you give somebody that, they could deduct your SSI cash benefit. But under ABLE, it shows that as long as you take the money out of the account in the same month in which you pay for rent or things like that, it will not affect the person's SSI. Okay. But speaking of SSI, so why did I say that ABLE account, funds in an ABLE account will be disregarded with respect to most federally funded means tests, as opposed to all federally funded means tested benefits? That's because there's one exception, and that relates to people who open an ABLE account who also are on SSI, Supplemental Security Income, right? It won't be all people that have ABLE accounts, and if you have an ABLE account and you're not, either maybe you have an ABLE account through the disability certification, or maybe you got an ABLE account through SSDI, then you don't need to worry about this next part. But if you do, in fact, are in fact a beneficiary of SSI, then when your account breaches basically $100,000, the cash benefit related to your SSI, that monthly cash benefit, I think it maxes out at like $735 right now, $733, will be temporarily suspended until such time as the account falls back below that $100,000 threshold. So it's a very important thing to know, but then again, we're not going to see this happen for a while because of $14,000. All right. That's right, but it's something that's very, very serious because a lot of people, despite that being relatively a modest amount of money, it's very important to people with disabilities in many circumstances. So we've talked to the ABLE account managers and we've started to discuss, and I think a lot of them are putting in safeguards to where once the account starts to get up to in the 90s or so, and remember these things are actually investment accounts, so they can grow interest. So just because you stop it at $99,999, don't think that you're not going to breach that and it couldn't, shut down your SSI payment, because it could be an investment vehicle that is yielding interest. You could also lose money. But anyways, not the point right now. Those programs will notify, are expected to notify that individual to let them know you're about to come up on this, you're at 95 or 90,000. You need to be aware of what's going to happen if you breach this and you're on SSI. You need to make a decision about what you want to do. Indefinite. So you can be off of it for 2, 3, 4, 5 indefinitely. And you're still technically eligible for SSI. You're still considered an SSI beneficiary with all the other benefits related to SSI, including, and probably most importantly, Medicaid. Doesn't touch your Medicaid just because it's the cash benefit, under SSI. You're still on SSI. It's the cash benefit related to SSI. You're off of SSI. Not necessarily, not even that. And technically you're still on SSI. It's instantaneous is what it's supposed to be. Now, Social Security is still going to work this out, and they understand they have some time to do this. But the idea is as soon as it drops back down for that given month, you'll get your check. The check is the only thing that you won't receive anymore, basically. You're still an SSI beneficiary. You're just an SSI beneficiary without your check until such time as the account falls back below that particular threshold. And technically, it can go above it, but every dollar above it is counted as a resource. So if you have a checking account and you have $500 sitting in there, technically, and that's your entire resources, and your ABLE account is at 100,000 and 500. Technically, you're still going to get it because combined, that's 500 and 500 is only 1,000. It's when it reaches the $2,000 mark, but just for all intents and purposes, $100,000 is what to pay attention to. Housing expenses, we talked about that. They can be paid for funds within an ABLE account, but it's important to note that you'd want to take the money out of the account in the same month in which you spend it on rent, or else it could affect your SSI. So that's important to note. Again, impact on federal benefits. We just wanted to again stress this because we know how important Medicaid is, that even if the account exceeds $100,000 and the SSI cash benefit is suspended, the Medicaid and all other benefits related to SSI still remain, with the exception of that cash check monthly cash payment. So I think lastly, this is another big issue that probably the most criticized aspect of an ABLE account is the Medicaid payback provision. And what it says is any assets remaining in the ABLE account when the beneficiary passes away, with the subject to outstanding qualified disability expenses, including burial and funeral expenses, can be used to reimburse a state for Medicaid payments made on behalf of the beneficiary after the creation of the ABLE account. So, provided that we do have a severity criteria related to having an ABLE account, might suggest that the individual will in fact be utilizing Medicaid supports and services. And as many of us know, Medicaid supports and services are often very costly, right? And the state pays attention to how much money it costs to provide these services to every single beneficiary of Medicaid. So when that person passes away, they're going to take a look and see to what extent monetarily did this person use Medicaid from the point in which they opened up the ABLE account to the point in which they passed away. And then they can go file claim with the ABLE account administrator to grab that money back to the extent that there is actually funds in the account. So this is an amazing and a great tool that's very financially accessible to people with disabilities to get around asset limits and to save without leaving vulnerable their federally funded means-tested benefits. This is not necessarily a wealth transfer tool. So if you're interested in giant amounts of money being transferred after the beneficiary passes away, you might want to look at things like a special needs trust. And there's no reason why you couldn't have a special needs trust and an ABLE account. In many circumstances, I could give stories about how they could be, the benefits of having both could outweigh having either one alone, right? But the thing about a special needs trust, oftentimes they are much more costly to set up and maintain. You have to get an attorney. They're just more complicated. These are really built to provide for a very similar type of benefit, but be far more financially accessible to families and individuals. When they were looking at special needs trust, they realized this is an amazing benefit. People are really being able to provide a brighter future with it. However, why is this being excluded, just basically being used by people with higher socioeconomic backgrounds? And they said, well, that's not really right. So along came ABLE. All right, how are we doing? So I think that's pretty much it for my presentation, part of the presentation. Little information, everybody should have gotten some information on the ABLE National Resource Center. That's a collaborative of about 25 different national disability-related organizations. It's a resource center run by NDI, and you can go to the website there, www.ablenrc.org. Has a lot of informative videos, webinars. It has a comparison tool, so you can compare up to 3 different state programs at a time next to each other based on a number of different characteristics that you might want to take into consideration when determining which program is best for you. There's a mailing list on there so you can get up-to-date information. There's information on legislative changes to the bill or to the law that we're looking into. And just a great wealth of ABLE-related information on there. So I encourage folks to take a look at that. You can submit questions through the website, and they'll go to our ABLE National Resource Center team. So with that, I want to give it over to Karen, who's going to tell you a little more specifically about the program here in Iowa.
Thanks, Chris. And it's always great following Chris because a lot of my slides we're going to skip, and I know we're kind of short on time now. So what I want to do is give you guys just kind of a brief, the plan that we did introduce in the state of Iowa just in January. So you know more about that, but clearly, and I did not get these slides. I will see if they can distribute the information back out to you about our program. Very similar to what Chris said, that IABLE as an ABLE plan allows some persons with disabilities and their families to save. He talked about saving for disability-related expenses, earn tax breaks. Are any of you familiar with College Savings Iowa? It's Iowa's 529 plan. The concept here was to give that same ability to save, that people could save for college. Why can't they save for expenses related to somebody with a disability? So that was really part of where this came from. And then protect those eligibility assistance programs. Just really quickly, the journey to IABLE is what I call it, and it was quite a journey. As Chris said, this was passed in 2014. Why didn't we have this up and running immediately? This was a lot more difficult than we thought. Iowa was one of the first states in the spring of 2015. Iowa passed the legislation, and they gave the job to the state treasurer's office, which I do just want to say, when we refer to Treasury, when Chris says Treasury, remember there's a state treasurer's office and then there's a federal treasury. So a lot of these rules that we're talking about go through the federal treasury. They're not our rules. It'd be a lot easier if they were. So, but what we wanted to do is take the expertise that we have from creating one of the country's best 529 plans and say, how can we create something for Iowans to be able to save in these ABLE accounts? We had 3 goals. I joke here because one of our goals, actually the first one, was simple. We learned very quickly that these plans are not like a 529 college savings plan. So after you take the A off, these are nothing alike. So simple was a little bit off the table, but we have done what we can to try to simplify a very complex savings program. Inexpensive. I think that's one of the things the states add value to in these programs across the country is we can provide these services, access to really good investment funds for a relatively low price, and then user-friendly. It was really important to us. We don't want to create a great program and then nobody can figure out how to enroll in it. So what we decided was a group of states came together because we have a lot of expertise in the 529 arena, and we had all worked independently in the 529 arena, although we're part of a group. But we knew that this was a brand new program. We were starting out with $0. It's really hard to get somebody to say, we'll do the record keeping for a program that has $0. And when they ask, well, how quickly is it going to grow? Well, we don't know. The most anybody can put in is $14,000. That kind of scares people away. We just didn't know what the growth was going to be like, but we knew that if a group of us came together, we were going to have the economies of scale. We were going to be able to maybe successfully launch something that was inexpensive. There were a group, I want to say there were 9 of us that started at the table. We now have 14 members and we continue to grow. So that's 14 member states. We're getting really close to representing the population of half of the country right now. ABLE eligibility, I'm not going to spend time on this slide right now because I think Chris did a fabulous job of explaining the eligibility requirements. So I am going to just kind of skip over that one so we can get to the Iowa program. The self-certification, one thing we talked a little bit about, and somebody did ask a question, but what's really important from our aspect is it is self-certification. The state treasurer's office nor a census is the company that does our record keeping. Neither one of us is going to tell you have to prove that you're eligible. But we're going to say, I can't give tax or legal advice, but I will say you really should have something that backs up that you are eligible, because otherwise, you're taking a tax benefit that you're not authorized to do so. And then what is a qualified disability expense? One of the great things I like about, Chris being before me is I don't get to answer near as much of that because we're the investment provider, we cannot give you tax or legal advice on these investments. So when we get a lot of questions about, well, what is or isn't a disability related expense, I think what's important to really hinge on there is maintaining or improving his or her health, independence, or quality of life. We do know the broad categories, and we concur with what Chris said earlier, that the intention was to make them broad categories. So we do know education, health and wellness, housing, transportation, legal fees, all of those kind of things that are important as people are basically just to improve the quality of their life. One of the things that actually this came out of the last presentation that Chris and I worked on, when he made the recommendation that you keep track of what those expenses are. We just put up on our website 2 days ago. This is not a tax document, and we don't promise if you use this Excel document that the IRS will accept that. But one of the things was just to help people get organized. It's just a log that you can use to say, okay, on this day, I took the money out. Here's how much I took it out. Here's who the payee was. And here's that brief description that Chris recommended. We put this up on our website as a resource because it does help. We do think that it is really important. And then just keep that with your tax records. Again, it's the IRS during an audit that is going to determine whether or not these were eligible funds. So Chris talked about the federal tax benefits. They're great. But if you are familiar with the College Savings Iowa tax benefits, Iowa made those even better. One of the things Iowa felt was really important when they passed this legislation was, if we're going to do this, we're going to give the same benefits to ABLE that we gave to college savings. So the savings grow tax deferred. So when you have the money in there, if it's in an investment account and it's growing, there are no taxes as it's growing. All withdrawals are state tax exempt. So when you take the money out, there is no tax on the growth. And then they added a state tax deduction equal to what the 529 tax deduction is. Now, ABLE, in 529, we have a really simple, this is where simple comes back in again, graph of how the deduction works. It's a little more complicated in ABLE, and this is one of the slides I just want to make sure we have a chance to go over. So Chris talked about the $14,000 maximum in no given year, and that amount could go up. That's up to the federal government if they raise that, whether it's annually or once in a while. But that $14,000 for 2017 stands. And the amount at the top, $3,239, that's the maximum any one taxpayer can take as a deduction from IABLE. If you're familiar with College Savings Iowa, that deduction is for the account owner, and it's a 1-for-1. So if you have a spouse and you both want to contribute, you both have to have an account. That's the huge distinction here with an ABLE account. Anybody can contribute to your ABLE account. The owner of that account is always that person with a disability, whether they're a 2-year-old or a 52-year-old. They're the ones that own the funds. So in this example, we say, okay, this is the person with the disability. Let's say they do have resources, so they put $1,000 in. If they actually had income that they were filing their taxes, they could take $1,000 tax deduction. But let's say dad contributes $9,000. Well, dad can take that $3,239 tax deduction. That's it. He can't take a $9,000 deduction because our maximum is that, but he can contribute more than that amount. Then let's say Uncle Joe decides he wants to give a gift of $3,000. Well, he can deduct the $3,000. He hasn't met that. And then grandma gives for Christmas $500. She can deduct that as well. Each of those Iowa taxpayers, they can only do it if they're Iowa taxpayers, each of them have to keep their own records on that. We cannot track who made those contributions to the account. As far as we're concerned, we're holding an account for this person. We don't know where that money came from, but it does allow those other people to make those contributions. It's a little complicated. The thing to understand, though, is if you have anyone here that doesn't have an advantage for giving a tax deduction, they probably want to put their money in at the end. Once we hit $14,000, there is no more. That's not about the tax deduction. That's about contributions. If grandma at Christmas time says, I want to give $1,000, there's already been $14,000 contributed to that account, that check will get sent back to you, or it will be rejected if it's online. That's a federal requirement. So I kind of went through that quickly. This graph is also on our website, but I think it helps kind of understand how that works. I'm not going to spend any time on the Social Security income eligibility. I think Chris did a great job with that, the $100,000. We are putting safeguards in place, but we also know we have a while to do that at $14,000 a year. There's no urgency to that, but we certainly will be putting safeguards in place, as Chris talked about, because we want people to be well aware of the fact if there is anything that could compromise that benefit. Medicaid eligibility, Chris talked about that. An ABLE account will not impact Medicaid eligibility, but for any of you that are familiar with Iowa Medicaid, there is right now that provision, and I think Chris is correct in saying that's probably the most unpopular portion of this bill, but there is a provision that Iowa Medicaid, or the Medicaid, so for us here, Iowa Medicaid, can have I don't want to use a recapture, it's the right word to use. They have indicated to us at this point that is their intention. Again, you would have to talk to Iowa Medicaid. We are not the agency that handles that, but we do want to make sure people understand that up front. The funeral expenses actually come out before Medicaid reimbursement. So if you have any outstanding items, so if there were outstanding items at the time that the individual passed away, Medicaid is they're not very far down, but they're not first on the list. So funeral and burial expenses definitely come before Medicaid does. So as I said earlier, our goals were to make it easy to understand, inexpensive, and user-friendly. And I'm just going to kind of skip through this because I think 1:30 is our stop, right? Okay. So just so you can see, and all of this information is on our website, what we have are 7 investment options. Basically, the first 6 are investment options. They allow you, and we, kind of simplified it for this graph, but stocks and bonds. So if you want to be aggressive and have most of your money in stock, you can, or if you want to be conservative and have most of your money in, cash, you can do that. So the first 6 are a variety of different investment options that are available with varying degrees of aggressiveness. The last option, and just real quick, BlackRock, Schwab, and Vanguard are the 3 investment providers. So again, if you're familiar with College Savings Iowa, that's all Vanguard. There are some others in the mix here. The checking option, though, is a separate option, and that is Fifth Third Bank. Which here in Iowa, we don't have any brick and mortar Fifth Third banks, so people aren't as familiar with them. But that is a checking option that is available. It allows you to move that money in and out a little more readily than maybe the investment options. No, I do have to say I cannot guarantee investment returns. So in the first 6 options, every one of those has some degree in stocks or bonds. So if you're in one of those 6, you are subject to the movement of the market. Now, if you're in the aggressive one, you're subject to more gain or more loss. I mean, there's always, market goes both ways. If you're in that checking option, though, that checking option is essentially an FDIC insured product. It's not invested in the market. You're not going to go below, your asset value in the actual checking option. So that would be the one, I guess I'm going to say safer option. There is, and really quickly, I want to go through this, and I think most of the rest of it I can get through really quickly, but there's a complex federal requirement, like there's only one, right? There's a complex federal requirement that talks about your ability as an investor. So whoever owns this account, whether or not you can change those investments. So if you had your money in the aggressive and you're thinking, oh boy, I think the market's not going to go well, I want to move that to the conservative option, you can make that kind of a move twice per year. This is the same way it is with college savings, and they kept that provision here, which is generally fine. You can withdraw your money at any time. So this does not lock your money up. It just says that you can't sit there every day. We're not day traders. We're not, you can't make those investment changes. One of the things we don't have in College Savings Iowa that is in ABLE is this checking account. So you can't treat an investment account. So let's say you put money in the growth portfolio, but you want to pay rent every month. So you need to transfer it to your checking account. You can't do 12 transfers. You can do 2. We did create what we call a systematic exchange process where you can say, okay, well, I'm going to make this one decision which says every month on the 10th, I want to move $600 from one of my investment accounts to my checking account. That's not going to, that you can do that. You can systematically allow it to move money from one option to another. You just can't call us up and say, hey, I want to move $1,000 from one investment option to another. Again, that's a regulation that came over from the 529 industry. The idea is this is a savings vehicle. That's a little bit different with ABLE, but that regulation held with ABLE. So we worked really hard to try to find a way for people to do that. With the checking option, which again is very different, you actually will have a debit card and checks if you would like. We've had people ask about, do you have to have the debit card? And you can cut up the debit card like any other debit card, and you don't have to order the checks if you don't want the transactional part of that. Really fast, I think we're over time. Our plan is an incredibly competitive financial plan. ABLE has not figured out how to compare things apples to apples yet. So when you look at other plans, it's really hard to compare them. Hopefully, we have ways to compare 529s that will compare a little bit better moving in the future. But for an ABLE account, it's $5 a month. You can get $1.25 of that discounted if you choose e-delivery. And for the checking option, that is $2 a month. But again, that entire amount can be discounted if you either have over $250 or you are enrolled in e-delivery of those account statements. So the goal was to keep it as low price as possible. And finally, what we wanted to do was to make a user-friendly website. I think you can go visit our website. Hopefully it's user-friendly. We would love any feedback on our website, though. This is a brand new program for the State Treasurer's Office, a brand new website. So what we want to do is make sure that we are meeting everybody's needs. So we do welcome comments, and I apologize. We don't really have much more time for questions. No, you can withdraw money anytime you want. So you can withdraw at any time. What you can't do is move money from one investment option to another. So it's your money, and that's what we want to make sure people understand. This money, it's definitely people's money to spend. I think that's a carryover from the concept of an actual college savings account where you put it in and don't need it for years. You can do either. You can tell us to pay the account owner directly. One of the things I didn't talk about is an authorized individual. If somebody is under the age of 18 or over the age of 18 and not capable, they do have to have the paperwork. We talked about that before, guardianship, power of attorney, whatever that is. That authorized individual, that check could go to the authorized individual if they legally have financial rights over that account, or to the account, the beneficiary, or to a third party if that's who you'd like us to distribute those to.